The early 90s were a magical time for gamers, especially those who owned 16-bit consoles like the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo Entertainment System. When Disney's Aladdin hit theaters in 1992, it was only a matter of time before the charismatic street rat swung onto our consoles. But what made Aladdin on the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo stand out wasn't just the source material, it was the heated rivalry between these two versions. Both games were released in 1993, but they were vastly different experiences, each showcasing the unique strengths of their respective consoles and developers. The Genesis version was developed by Virgin Games, with legendary designer David Perry leading the charge. The Super Nintendo version, created by Capcom under the guidance of Shinji Mikami. Both games shared the same story beats, loosely following the plot of the movie as Aladdin journeys from the streets of Agrabah to the Cave of Wonders, and finally faces off against Jafar. Yet, their approaches couldn't be more different. This rivalry wasn't just about preference, it was part of the broader console war of the era, with gamers hotly debating which version was superior. Even today, the Genesis and Super Nintendo versions of Aladdin are often held up as examples of how the same license can result in two incredibly distinct, yet equally beloved games. At their core, both the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo versions of Aladdin follow the general plot of Disney's 1992 blockbuster movie. Aladdin is a diamond in the rough, a street-smart thief from Agrabah who dreams of a better life. His journey takes him from the bustling marketplace to the mystical Cave of Wonders, through to his eventual showdown with the scheming sorcerer Jafar. However, the two games approach this storytelling in distinctly different ways, reflecting their respective design philosophies. The Genesis version keeps things light on narrative. There are occasional interludes between levels featuring static images and brief text blurbs to bridge the story. These cutscenes hit the major beats: Aladdin finding the magic lamp, befriending the genie, and eventually confronting Jafar. Virgin Games leaned more heavily on visual flair and recreating iconic movie moments within the gameplay itself. Meanwhile, the Super Nintendo version takes a more detailed approach to weaving the story into the gameplay. Capcom used short, sprite-based cutscenes between levels to expand on the plot, giving players a bit more context before diving into the next stage. These scenes often mimic specific moments from the movie. Another key difference lies in the interpretation of Aladdin's character. On the Genesis, Aladdin is portrayed as more of a swashbuckling action hero, wielding a sword and slicing through enemies with a roguish flair. In contrast, the Super Nintendo version leans into Aladdin's resourcefulness. Without a sword, he uses his acrobatics and quick thinking to outmaneuver enemies, which feels closer to the movie's portrayal of the character as a clever underdog. In the end, the story is familiar in both games, but the way it's told reflects the priorities of each developer. Genesis prioritizes spectacle and action-packed moments, while Super Nintendo emphasizes platforming and a more faithful, character-driven narrative. Choice between the two feels almost like deciding which aspect of the movie you loved most: the breathtaking animation or the heartfelt story. When it comes to gameplay, the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo versions of Aladdin deliver wildly different experiences. Both games are platformers at heart, but the execution in each feels as if it was built with completely different audiences in mind. The Genesis version emphasizes fast-paced, combat-heavy action, while the Super Nintendo version is a more measured, puzzle-oriented platformer that rewards precision and exploration. Starting with the Genesis version, Virgin Games crafted a title brimming with action. Aladdin wields a scimitar, allowing him to engage enemies directly, which feels both satisfying and cinematic. Alongside swordplay, Aladdin can throw apples to attack from a distance, a mechanic both games share but use differently. The controls in the Genesis version are snappy and responsive, supporting Aladdin's ability to sprint through levels, slash enemies, and leap over hazards. This version is a bit more forgiving in its platforming, with generous hitboxes and level layouts that favor spectacle over precision. You'll find yourself bounding through iconic movie moments, like the chaotic escape from the Cave of Wonders or bouncing off camel humps in the marketplace. The Super Nintendo version, on the other hand, takes a completely different approach. Capcom's Aladdin strips away the sword, forcing players to rely on platforming agility and clever thinking to progress. Instead of slashing enemies, Aladdin can stun them with apples or dodge them altogether by using his gymnastic moves. The Super Nintendo version focuses on platforming mechanics like swinging from poles, bouncing off enemies, and carefully timing jumps across precarious gaps. The levels are more intricate, with hidden areas and collectibles that encourage players to slow down and explore every nook and cranny. The controls are just as tight as the Genesis version, but the slower pace demands more precision, making it feel a bit more methodical. Each game includes heart containers to increase Aladdin's maximum health, but finding them in the Super Nintendo version feels more rewarding since they're usually tucked away in challenging areas. One shared mechanic worth noting is the use of apples as a ranged attack. In both versions, apples serve as a limited resource, but their implementation varies. On Genesis, they complement the swordplay, while on Super Nintendo, they're often your only means of defense. This small difference underscores how the Genesis version feels more like an action game, while the SNES version leans heavily into platforming. Ultimately, the gameplay in both versions reflects their developers' priorities. The Genesis game is a showcase of thrilling, action-packed moments, with fluid animation and cinematic set pieces driving the experience. The Super Nintendo version offers a more technical platforming challenge, rewarding patience and skill over brute force. Both are excellent, but your preference likely depends on whether you're craving fast-paced action or thoughtful exploration. When it comes to the audiovisual presentation of Aladdin, both the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo versions shine in their own unique ways. Each game utilizes the strengths of its respective console, creating experiences that feel distinct yet equally nostalgic. The Genesis version is often praised for its stunning visuals, and for good reason. Virgin Games partnered with Disney animators to create sprites that look as if they were ripped straight from the movie. Aladdin's animations are silky smooth, with fluid, lifelike movements that make him feel alive. Whether it's the way he slashes his sword, flips through the air, or even adjusts his pants while idle, the attention to detail is remarkable. The Super Nintendo version, while not as visually flashy, delivers its own brand of charm through meticulous design. Capcom leaned into a more cartoonish aesthetic, using bold colors and exaggerated character designs to match the lighthearted tone of the film. Aladdin moves with agility, and though his animations aren't as fluid as the Genesis version, they're still detailed and expressive. Sound design is another area where the two games diverge. The Genesis version's soundtrack, composed by Donald S. Griffin and Tommy Tallarico, leans heavily into the Genesis's signature FM synthesis. The result is a series of upbeat, driving tracks that capture the adventurous spirit of the film while adding an arcade-like energy. Iconic songs like A Whole New World and Friend Like Me are adapted with a punchy, bass-heavy twist that fits the fast-paced gameplay perfectly. Sound effects are similarly sharp and impactful, from the clang of Aladdin's sword to the sizzle of lava in the Cave of Wonders. The Super Nintendo version, on the other hand, takes full advantage of the Super Nintendo's superior sound chip to deliver a soundtrack that's closer to the movie's original orchestration. The music feels richer and more melodic, with tracks that evoke the grandeur of the film. Arabian Nights and Prince Ali sound lush and vibrant, with layered instrumentation that enhances the game's immersive feel. Capcom's attention to audio detail extends to the sound effects, which are crisp and varied. The swish of Aladdin's jumps and the comedic bounce of enemies add a whimsical touch to the overall presentation. It's a classic case of two developers using their platform's strengths to craft visually and sonically distinct interpretations of the same source material. The legacy of Aladdin for the Sega Genesis and SNES is as timeless as the tale itself. Both games remain standout titles in the library of 16-bit classics, remembered not just for their quality, but for the unique ways they represented the console wars of the early 1990s. These two adaptations are more than just video game versions of a beloved Disney movie. They are prime examples of how different creative teams, armed with the same source material, can craft vastly distinct yet equally influential games. The Genesis version of Aladdin is often celebrated as one of the best-looking games on the console. Its groundbreaking use of Disney animators to create fluid, hand-drawn sprites was a game-changer, pushing the boundaries of what could be done visually on a 16-bit platform. The SNES version of Aladdin carved out its own legacy as a masterclass in platforming. Capcom's interpretation didn't aim to compete with Virgin's animation wizardry. Instead, it focused on tight gameplay mechanics and intricate level design. Many players argue that this version more faithfully captures the spirit of the movie, emphasizing Aladdin's agility and cleverness over combat. Both games also left a lasting impact on the gaming industry. The Genesis version's use of professional animators set a precedent for future collaborations between game studios and animation experts. Meanwhile, Capcom's Aladdin reinforced the value of tight gameplay design and the importance of staying true to the essence of a franchise, lessons that would carry forward into other Capcom classics. Today, both versions of Aladdin are still celebrated by retro gaming enthusiasts. The games were included in compilations like the Disney Classic Games Collection, allowing modern audiences to experience the magic of Agrabah all over again. This re-release reignited the debate over which version reigned supreme, proving that their legacy isn't just historical,